Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
As Japan continues to rumble from its giant earthquake and tsunami, the impacts are felt across the Pacific Ocean, with strong waves striking the west coast.
The elected officials find themselves bogged
Governor
down.
Brown is holding last-minute budget negotiations with Republicans after missing his self-imposed deadline for a special election. California's 2010 census data reveals which communities and ethnic populations are gaining ground throughout the state. And the police corruption scandal in San Francisco widens, with more than 50 criminal cases dropped by DA George Gascon. Coming up next.
I am so honored.
Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Rachel Gordon, City Hall reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle; Scott Schaefer, host of the California Report on KQED Public Radio 88.5 FM; and Josh Richmond, legal and political affairs reporter for the Oakland Tribune; and Tom Vakar, consumer editor for KTVU News. Tom, you were at the USGS today. What did you find out there, and what is the latest that they could tell you?
Well, probably the most astonishing idea was that many of us remember the Loma Prieta quake. This was on the order of 1,000 times stronger in Japan. Really a biblical proportion. You have to go back 1,000 years in the geologic record to see the kind of tsunami situation that they had. Having said all of that, not too many hours later, that tsunami sped across the Pacific, rammed into Hawaii, and then came to the west coast and did some pretty significant damage in Crescent City, Fort Bragg, and then a little bit we'll be talking about Santa Cruz. One person up in Crescent City who thought he would be brave and go out and take pictures in a river ended up being lost and probably dead. Many coastal roads were closed. Beaches were closed, including right here in San Francisco. BART was not closed, but the Vallejo Ferry stopped 3 runs out of concern for possible problems in the bay. And many flights to Japan were out and out canceled. And those that were in the air already were diverted to other places like Osaka and Nagoya, and even one went into an Air Force base. So it is all in all a pretty amazing thing. But the damage to California is significant, so much so that the governor, Jerry Brown, has declared 4 counties, Del Norte, Humboldt, San Mateo, and Santa Cruz, emergency situation, and they will receive some aid. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of what happened.
Well, let's turn to Paul Rogers in Santa Cruz now. Paul, you're in Santa Cruz today, and you actually witnessed some of this damage as it took place.
Yeah, I was at the Santa Cruz Harbor from about 9 a.m. on. The first surges came in around 8, and then another really big surge occurred at 11:15 a.m. when I was there. And it was just remarkable. I've lived in Santa Cruz for 22 years. I've never seen anything like this. It broke up about 30 boats, either flipped these large boats over, sunk them outright, smashed them into other boats. At one point, when it came in again, people had gotten too close to the harbor, and police on loudspeakers were yelling, evacuate immediately, big wave coming, and people were rushing, hundreds of people rushing up the hills, tripping over each other, and by lunchtime, there was a jet ski in the water, smashed up against the jetty without a rider, diesel fuel all over the water, 20-foot sections of wooden dock that had floated out to the ocean, and just a really muddy soup of plastic bottles and life jackets and upside-down boats, masts sticking out of the water. They're estimating the damage is about $15 million right now.
At first, it didn't seem as though California was going to be really injured much by that. The first waves on the 3 feet up the coastline there, but things that
But
got worse.
that's the problem with tsunamis, is that many people think that it's one tidal wave, one thing, and in fact it's multiple waves that come, and very often the second or third or fourth wave may be the strongest of all of those waves, because while they may not be very high, the fact is that they have very long moment, which means there's a lot of high water behind them. It just keeps coming and coming. And in this case, these multiple waves kept coming in, and they would come into a place like, for example, Crescent City. How much damage happens really is a function of, according to the USGS, as to how the bay is oriented towards the incoming wave, and then how shallow the bay is, how small the bay is, and how the water actually enters, because you basically almost get a toilet bowl kind of effect that's going on there. And if you have a smaller bay, what happens is it just goes in there and wreaks havoc. On a bigger estuary like the San Francisco Bay, where a lot of water moves in and out, and there's a tremendous amount of water in there already, there's much less of a problem. But on these smaller bays, they are highly vulnerable, and we learned that lesson at 3 places
Tom,
today.
explain why. This morning there was Bart was saying that if the waves up north had gotten to a certain level, they were going to shut down the system. What's the relationship there?
Well, the concern is that, you know, if too much water would come into the San Francisco Bay and drive the overall level up, which is a distinct possibility, imagine if it comes up over the shoreline there and starts coming up Market Street and starts dumping down into the Muni and into the Barton and gets into the tunnel and all of that stuff. That is a real problem in a major quake, and then what you have to do is you have to worry about, you know, life safety and everything else. So they were being very careful so that they didn't have a situation where they had people on trains that were either going to be, stuck in water or possibly buried in water, and that's what they thought about.
Tom, what about our tsunami warning system in California? I mean, it was shored up several years ago, at least in San Francisco and other places. Do we know if it worked? Were there any of the big sirens going off to actually evacuate people? And I mean, Japan is supposed to be one of the most disaster-prepared countries in the world, but there seems to be nothing that they could have done to prepare for this.
I think in the pecking order, Japan is first, and then Hawaii is second, because they deal with tsunamis on a fairly regular basis. And California actually did reasonably well. Most people believe that people were informed largely because the media was there and informed people. And of course, people were mesmerized by what they had seen the evening before with what happened in Japan. And we heard that this thing was coming. That is sufficient warning for most people. Having said that, there were plenty of spectators that went down to the water. There were plenty of people that went down there and just wanted to see what was going on.
It's like our YouTube culture. Everyone wants to put their own film up.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Paul for a minute. Now, Paul, you said you went down there and you were there most of the morning. Why did you go down there?
I'm a newspaper reporter. That's why there's news there.
Paul, you know, I wonder.
And I'll tell you, just in terms of the action on the coast, both San Mateo County and Santa Cruz County had voluntary evacuations early this morning. Literally thousands of people evacuated from places like Pacifica, Half Moon Bay, Santa Cruz near the boardwalk, Capitola. Some people drove up as high as the Skyline Ridge area, 2,000 feet up in the mountains, which, if you think about it, is a little overkill, because the size of the biggest waves are maybe 20 or 30 feet. So, you wouldn't have to go that far. But on the other hand, there were surfers who were running down to the waves and getting in there. And we have some photos, and we heard accounts of when the water first rushed out around 8 a.m., it rushed very far away from the shoreline. And people who were surfing in Santa Cruz near the boardwalk were suddenly standing in ankle-deep water.
You got to ask.
Some of them ran back in, and some didn't.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, Tom, again. Were there any concern about the nuclear power plant and leaks from there? Is that any concern for California?
Well, there should be no concern for California. I mean, Diablo Canyon is fine. But in Japan, there are a couple of nuclear power plants there, because a third of the electricity comes from nuclear power. One actually had to start venting some radioactive gas, and there was concern about being able to keep one of the containment vessels cool enough, and that is an ongoing problem there. Whether or not that will rise to the level of being a real emergency, we do know that the people around there were evacuated.
As interesting as this is, I have to move to another emergency, and that's the California budget, which Josh Richmond has the latest on. The governor's attempt to get something done with the legislature.
This last story, you want to avoid all kinds of nuclear option metaphors now with the budget for a while, obviously. So we had this self-imposed deadline that Governor Jerry Brown had set yesterday to get the legislature to vote on his tax and budget cut proposal. The idea was that that would leave enough time to call a special election to let voters decide whether to do a 5-year extension of existing income, car, and sales taxes on June 7th. The deadline is now gone. We're hoping to get a budget deal next week. State Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg says possibly as early as Monday if they can do enough negotiating over the weekend. The governor is huddled down with 5 relatively moderate state senators, hoping that they can work out some sort of a deal. They're holding out for some sort of pension reform and perhaps some other things. Governor Brown today said that they're trying to come up with some sort of pension reform proposal on the fly. So it's all very dynamic.
Do you have any sense of what the bottom lines are? I mean, what are the Republicans really holding out for? What do they have to have? What would they like to have, and what are they willing to let go of?
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell because some of this is going on behind closed doors. But generally, you got to remember that the governor is only negotiating with 5 Republicans. The rest of the Republicans are refusing to vote in favor of this special election because they don't believe voters should even be asked to extend these taxes. These 5 are sort of holding out for pension, regulatory reform, other government changes, some budgeting changes, which actually is what a lot of the chambers of commerce and other business groups that came to Governor Brown's support this week said they'd like to see as well. Except they sort of said, you know, we're going to support this on the condition that you get to that next, rather than right
Josh,
now.
let me ask you about the Chamber of Commerce support. That was a big deal.
It is.
For the governor to get that.
Well, they didn't quite endorse it, though. They were friendly.
No, but they also said they weren't going to fight it, which
Right.
is pretty important because they have a lot of money to fight these measures. Is that having any sway at all, though, really, with the Republicans? I mean, we've always heard Republicans, no taxes, we want this reforms, but do they want to move, or do they just want to get into a partisan fight with the Democrats at this point?
You know, the thinking is that having all of these business groups, not just chambers of commerce like San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles come to the support of this plan, but also groups like the Bay Area Council and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. Today there is about 24 agricultural groups, although notably not the California Farm Bureau, through their support behind it. The idea is that this perhaps would give some political cover to those Republicans who would cross the aisle and vote in favor of it. But you got to look at the way that all of these business groups are phrasing their statements and the way that they're being, rolling these out. Budget cuts are necessary but can be costly in terms of lost jobs and services. Letting the voters decide if temporary tax measures should be extended is appropriate, but we'll evaluate those measures when they're formulated. So they're not saying we want you to raise taxes. They're saying, all right, let the voters decide. We got to break the logjam. Let's go ahead and do this. But we also want to see you address these other things that are of concern to us.
Is this whistling past the graveyard, though? And the graveyard being that either it doesn't get on the ballot or the public says no to these extensions. I mean, is that really something they're talking about, or are they just thinking this isn't going to be a possibility?
When has this not been whistling past the graveyard in the past 10 years that you can recall of budget negotiations in Sacramento? The idea of having it on having the special election June 7th is that falls before the June 15th constitutional deadline for passing a budget. We never meet that deadline, right? It would be a shocker if we actually did this year. And there's still room for the legislature to shorten the election preparation schedule. We could still have a vote on June 7th, even if they get a deal next week, or if it happens in July, it happens in July. But, there is the chance that there is going to be a strong campaign for and against these taxes if it comes to a special election.
Josh, can I ask one question? The Democrats are in the majority
They are.
in Sacramento. We talk very little about them. And the 5 who are talking about negotiating, are they negotiating to let the taxes go on the ballot?
Yes.
Or not to say they would support any tax
No, I don't
increase?
think you'll ever get any of these
okay.
senators to be in favor of extending those taxes. But what they're saying is we will let this go to a special election. We will let the voters decide on this if you can show us that you're serious about pension reform, long-term budget reform, regulatory rollbacks.
And those 5 come from more moderate districts?
Generally so, yes. San Luis Obispo, Ceres, Modesto, for the most part, sort of swing districts.
Can I ask a quick question just about the governor politically on
yeah.
this? I mean, he's come in very confident and cocky, really, that he could do this. Is he having second thoughts about wanting to be governor again?
I
mean, no. Is he up to this task? I mean, he seems like if he gets to roadblock there, he's going this different direction.
No, I
Anything
don't.
slowing him down at this point?
I don't get the sense that he's demoralized necessarily by missing, yesterday's deadline. I think he, if you look at the language he's using, he keeps rolling out these expressions of support day after day after day. He's confident that they're on track to reach some sort of deal, possibly as early as next week.
I go back to the Democrats again,
Yes.
who are in the majority.
Indeed.
Is the governor confident that they will negotiate with him to the end that his Republican five
They are
willing
certainly
to?
confident. I think he's confident that the Democrats would support having this special election. When it comes to some of the specific cuts, I had Sandre Swanson from the East Bay tell me that he's not in favor of voting to abolish redevelopment agencies and enterprise zones because cities like Oakland are very much dependent
Yes,
on
but
them.
won't the governor have to agree to do those things to get those 5 votes?
Well, actually, the Republicans are not so hot about the redevelopment abolition either. But yeah, there is a balance that has to be struck. I think the governor is more concerned right now with getting some Republican votes for this plan. At the moment, he has none. Than with keeping his own party in line.
But there's optimism that even as early as Monday.
You never know.
You never know. Well, there are a few things we do know. The Census, the latest one, is in, and it's going to determine some political futures as well as a lot of funding situations. So, Scott Schaefer, tell us about that.
Well, the 2010 data came out this week, and it showed California is a bigger place. We knew that. It's grown by about 10%. But we got more detail about the ethnic makeup and racial makeup of the state. The biggest, fastest growing group in California, Asian Americans, grew by about 31%. Latinos grew by about 28%, and we saw a slight dip in the overall percentage of the population that African Americans are in California, and also a slight dip in the percentage of white folks who live here as well. What it means is that political representation is going to change as well. All this information goes to the Redistricting Commission, which is going to draw the political lines for the 2012 election. And what it shows is that the coast is not growing nearly as fast as the inland counties. The Bay Area, for example, the 9-county Bay Area, they grew by about an average of 5%, each of the counties. Compare that with Placer County in the Sierra Foothills or Riverside County in the Inland Empire. They grew more than 40%. So you can see that shift over the course of the decade has been from the coasts to the inland areas, and that's going to be reflected in the new congressional lines. The Bay Area will probably lose 1 seat. You might see 2 seats kind of combined into one. Maybe we'll see a retirement of someone like, say, Pete Stark over from the East Bay. Not to predict anything, but something like that could happen. And the inner part of the state, either the Inland Empire or the Central Valley, perhaps will gain a seat. So you're going to see that shift of power, perhaps, as well.
Does this have anything to do with the housing patterns, where housing was being built over that last decade? And wasn't that housing primarily interior, because on the coast you couldn't have the kind of growth that you would have in building?
Well, we did see a housing boom, and that's the interesting thing about the data here. It's 10 years, so you see the dot-com bust is in here, the real estate boom is in here, and now the recession is in there as well. And yeah, there was a lot of housing built in places like Contra Costa, Brentwood, also in the inland places that I said where the populations went up. Cheaper housing, better schools, perhaps, safer neighborhoods, all drew people out of places like Oakland, which saw about a 2% drop in its overall population, into some of those places where housing was more affordable. Of course, sadly, a lot of those folks lost their homes during the foreclosure crisis. But overall, the State Department of Finance pointed out that there's 2% more housing stock on the market now than there was in 2000, and that reflects the overbuilding that happened, and also the foreclosures and the number of people losing their homes.
Scott, can I talk about the political power? And we see the big rise in the Latino population here, and yet Latinos still aren't voting in great numbers at all for myriad reasons. Is that going to change? Are people going to try to tap into that? And if Latinos do vote, what does that mean for California politics? Does it make it more democratic, more conservative, more just status quo? Well,
the share of the electorate that's a Latino has been growing, and the reason it's been sort of lower, much lower than the population, is that a lot of the folks are not citizens or haven't registered to vote. Now you've got the children of immigrants who are in the schools, and in the coming decade are going to be of voting age themselves, and you're going to see the electorate becoming more and more Latino, more and more Asian, so it'll better reflect the demographics of the state as a whole than it does today. Right now, the electorate in California is still about 70% white. So that's going to change. But what's also happening, and it refers back to what you said a moment ago, Belva, you've got Latinos and Asians moving from the cities into places like Contra Costa County, Sacramento, Stockton, Riverside. And so they're taking with them their slightly more democratic politics. So those parts of the state are going to become slightly more blue, or maybe less red is a better way to describe it.
Are these folks, though, voters? I mean, are these folks that are leaving, going to these areas voters, or are they just going to go there and live?
Well, as I said, a lot of certainly the children, as they grow up, they're now in the public schools in many cases. They are becoming more politicized and more part of the civic conversation, I think you could say. That's not good news for the Republican Party, of course, because not only here in California, but nationwide, you're seeing Republican positions on things like immigration, education cuts, and so on, is really driving, especially Latinos, to a lesser extent Asian Americans, away from the Republican Party.
I guess we're also seeing less of a monolithic ethnic vote as well. I mean, we're seeing that in San Francisco with the Chinese American vote, for example. You can't say they're all going to vote for one candidate or one issue for or against something. It seems that the interests have spread out and demands are different.
Well, and it's also true that all Latinos don't vote for the Latino candidate. If so, Abel Maldonado would be the lieutenant governor today.
So
perhaps.
let's talk about a place where we have all the ethnic mixes, but a pretty a critical problem right now with the police force for San Francisco.
Right, a new emerging police scandal in San Francisco. We aren't sure how big it's going to grow or if it's contained to what we know right now. And this is something that was brought to light by the public defender, Jeff Adachi, saying what he is saying is that he has video surveillance tapes from residential hotels that show, what he says, is that the police went into these rooms without a search warrant or without consent of the occupants there. And not only did they have illegal searches, but then when they testified in court about it, they perjured themselves because it was based on false testimony. It has quickly had pretty major fallout. That there have been 57 cases, criminal cases so far, mostly drugs, some robbery cases that have been dismissed by the district attorney, also by the courts have stepped in a little bit. Just today on Friday, District Attorney George Gascon, who happened to be the police chief at the time of this was in the late fall, earlier this year, that he recused himself from this, saying his office, the district attorney's office, isn't going to be investigating it at this time. He turned it over to the U.S. Justice Department. So the FBI is in there, the U.S. Attorney's Office is in there. The police department is doing its internal probe right now. So it's 7 officers, police officers, undercover, and their sergeant have been implicated in this.
When Gascon was appointed district attorney by the outgoing mayor, Gavin Newsom, there was this concern about a conflict of interest. And even though he's taken his office out of the investigation, he knows a lot where a lot of the bodies are buried in the police department. Is he going to be in some way still involved, do you think, in the investigation as, a source for perhaps for the FBI?
I mean, he could be. And don't forget, he's also going to be on the ballot in November. This is probably the worst time it could happen for a candidate under his watch. His hand-picked successor, Jeff Godin, who's the interim police chief now, is saying that he too is taking this seriously. And they worked in Los Angeles together, worked very closely together. I think it is fodder probably for George Gascon's opponents in the district attorney's race. It was probably very politically astute of him to get out of the investigation at this point. But he also was very clear, saying this wasn't about conflict, it was about other information that came to light. He didn't share what that information might have been. The question is it going to spread? Is it just this one unit out of Southern Station, which is the South of Market area, Tenderloin a little bit, Mission District, or is it going to be perhaps other areas?
And what exactly was the MO in these situations? What were the police actually doing that got caught on video that's causing these cases to go south?
They had master keys to the residential hotels, the police officers had. So what they're saying is that they had the keys, they had a suspect, suspected someone had drugs in their room or stolen property, whatever it may be. Or the suspects there themselves. They used the master keys to get into the rooms and then pull the people out. They didn't. You have to either have a search warrant to go in without someone's consent, or you have to knock on the door and say, "Police, may I come in?" to do that. Now, we know, I said earlier on another segment, the YouTube culture. I mean, we've seen this in a lot of places. There are cameras everywhere now, not just on people's cell phones, but surveillance cameras on street corners and buildings, and that's what happened. The public defender's office asked the hotel owner, can we get the surveillance tapes to see what happened? And that's when this came to light.
What prodded that? I mean, was it, did Jeff Adachi think this had been going on for a very long time, or did he think it was a new event? I mean, what is the history behind it?
Well, he's saying that it could go back years. In fact, he's asked for about 7 years of records on this. He also wants to see not just if the cameras were there, but with these specific police officers, have they been involved in in other arrests. He wants to go through every case. So we have 57 now. Could that potentially be thousands of cases? And don't forget, this just came about a year after San Francisco was embroiled in the other scandal. That was the crime lab, the drugs lab, where one technician was suspected of stealing drugs that were there, and that kind of forced San Francisco to toss out a lot of other cases.
You hang around City Hall a lot, and you hang around the police a lot. What's a student to their morale? It has to have some very negative impact with all this stuff building up.
Yeah, I mean, I think police feel under siege in many ways. I mean, there's a morale issue. They also have, I mean, just to be frank about it, they're going, look, we think that there are drugs in there, or there are bad things in there. Are we going to go through, as they should legally, go through the process to go get the search warrant and everything? They just wanted to go and get the stuff and not have someone slam a door in their face. So that's one thing. I can't speak for all of them. Probably we just wanted to do the right thing and get the bad guys behind bars.
And that's what they were being encouraged to do, to break up the drug traffic.
Right, and so they did make, and now a lot of these drug cases are just going to be tossed out. Now, as this is playing out, they're also searching for a new police chief in San Francisco, and that's going to play into this a lot. Thanks
so much, Rachel. In fact, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for this great discussion. Well, that's all the time that we have. You can visit kqed.org/thisweek anytime to watch complete episodes and segments, subscribe to our newsletter and our podcasts, and share your thoughts about the program. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.